Matthew Graham. And we continue to follow the breaking news here on the Fox Business Network. We hand it right over to Maria Bartiromo and Mornings with Maria for continued coverage.
Thank you so much, Nicole. We are following the breaking news and have new information this morning. Good morning. I'm Maria Bartiromo. It is Friday, July 15th. At least 84 people, including 2 Americans, are dead this morning after a truck slammed into a crowd celebrating Bastille Day in Nice. No group has claimed responsibility for this attack. At this point, there is no clear tie to ISIS, but French media is reporting the driver of the truck was a 31-year-old French Tunisian. He was shot by police after driving along a crowded sidewalk for over a mile, plowing into people celebrating Bastille Day. French authorities are currently searching his home. They are calling this terrorism. President Obama condemning the attack, promising that the U.S. will stand in solidarity with the French people. Presidential candidates Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton also reacting to the horror on Fox News last night.
It sounds like here we go again. It's going to be a whole different world. We're living in a whole different world. There's no respect for law and order. There's no respect for anything or anybody. And this has to be dealt with very harshly.
We've got to do more to understand that this is a war against these terrorist groups, the radical jihadist groups. It's a different kind of war. We need to be smart about how we wage it, but we have to be determined that we're going to win it.
Donald Trump has postponed his planned vice presidential announcement today in the wake of these attacks, which come just days ahead of the Republican National Convention. That's raising new security concerns for that event. Investors around the world reacting to the news. Stocks in Europe are lower this morning, with travel stocks and airline-related companies taking the hardest hit. In the U.S., futures are mostly flat. Traders are digesting this news and, of course, coming off of strength on earnings. Turning to markets in Asia overnight, the market was mixed. The Nikkei average once again continuing its momentum, up another 0.2% this morning in terms of market action. Joining me this morning to talk about it and break it all down, Fox Business Network's Dagan McDowell, former FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force member Steve Rogers with us, and Capitalist Pig founder and Fox News contributor Jonathan Hoenig. Good to see you, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Steve, Dagan. Steve, your thoughts on this attack this morning?
Maria, American blood, French blood, British blood, Israeli blood. The blood of the West is being spilled on our streets now. They have taken this war from the Mideast and they brought it right to the Western world.
Yeah. Our top story this morning is this breaking news out of Nice, France. At least 84 people have been killed, including at least 2 Americans. Amy Kellogg is en route to Nice right now. She joins us on the phone. Amy, good morning to you. What can you tell us?
Good morning, Maria. Well, I'm in Nice. I've been wandering around for the last few hours, actually, and it is a city that is completely zoned out and sad. I have seen tears, and I have seen most empty looks on people's faces. Clearly, this has shocked people immensely, and it was an indiscriminate attack. Russians were killed, Americans were killed, a Ukrainian was killed, and we will be learning much more over the coming hours. 50 children hospitalized for their injuries, and there were Middle Easterners here. I mean, Nice is a very international playground for people in the summer, and they were out celebrating the equivalent of the 4th of July for the French, Bastille Day. The driver of the truck has been killed, but this was the sort of attack that, of course, had been talked about on jihadist websites, but I don't think anyone really imagined that it could happen. Questions about how that truck managed to breach barricades and get onto the Promenade des Anglais, which was closed to vehicular traffic last night. Statements coming out from President Obama on behalf of the American people. I condemn in the strongest terms what appears to be a horrific terrorist attack in Nice, France, which killed and wounded dozens of innocent civilians. I've directed my team to be in touch with French officials, and we've offered any assistance they may need to investigate this attack and bring those responsible to justice. President Hollande here in France saying we cannot deny it was a terror attack. We have to demonstrate absolute vigilance and show determination that is unfailing. And Maria, what was interesting to me, having followed all of these attacks, just as you have and our viewers have, President Hollande was very quick to call this a terrorist attack before we had much information about the driver, before anything had been said. He came out, he knew what it was. France has been in the crosshairs of this, taken more hits than any other country in the European Union, and he has extended the state of emergency here, which was due to run out. That's been extended now, and they're asking for more police on the streets. But again, people are wondering how this tide can be stopped. Maria.
Does it surprise you that no one has taken responsibility just yet for this, Amy? What does that tell you?
Well, apparently ISIS doesn't always take responsibility, if in fact ISIS was behind it. I think that just remains to be seen. I think what we need to find out is more about the man, the Tunisian French man who drove the truck, whether he acted alone, and that will be very important to understand, or whether he was backed by others. He apparently had some first reports where he had weapons in his truck.
Right.
Apparently he did have a gun, but the other weapons may have not been active, Maria.
All right, Amy. We will get back to you as news develops this morning. Amy Kellogg is live on the ground this morning in Nice. I want to bring in Mike Baker right now, a former CIA covert operations officer. He's president of Diligence, a global intelligence and security firm. Mike, what's your initial reaction, and what about that question on no one's taking responsibility just yet?
Right. Well, I mean, Amy's absolutely correct. It's not consistent. You know, Al Qaeda, ISIS, they don't always claim immediately. Sometimes they don't claim. Sometimes they claim acts that they, at the end of the day, weren't responsible for, but find it useful for their agenda. In terms of a reaction to this attack, it's like Groundhog Day, and there's a certain sense of anger, but it's more frustration, and the frustration on the streets, whether it's in France or Germany, anywhere across the EU, here in the U.S. It's this sense of now what? How do we continue to process these attacks? And it's not, it's not good enough to finish something like this and say, okay, well, we got to look at the intel failure. That's typically the go-to. We have to go and figure out, how did this happen? Well, it's not an intelligence failure every time. And the problem is we don't go to the real key 30,000-foot problem, which is, we want to parse these things and say, well, is it Al Qaeda? Is it ISIS? Is it, is it inspired? Is it directed? It doesn't matter from their perspective. We've been fighting the same enemy for decades in terms of Islamic extremism, jihadism. We say this now constantly, but it's the same. And whether they're coming under one banner or another, in a sense, it doesn't really matter. The beast is the same.
Yeah, and it feels like they're getting stronger, Dagan McDowell. President Hollande extending a state of emergency by 3 months, pledging to hit ISIS even harder.
And I want to ask Mike a question related to that. Mike, why France in particular, with the 10 attacks since the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attack early last year, in about a year and a half? What is going on there in terms of cells that are in the country, in terms of radicalization, and in terms of the lack of security and intelligence potentially?
Yeah, well, you pointed to a really important question here, and part of it is, I hate to say this, but part of it's a self-inflicted wound when you're talking about, the problem that France is dealing with, and other parts of the European Union. Look, if you look at the foreign fighters that have traveled to Syria, traveled to Iraq for the Islamic State over the past handful of years, there are more than 80 countries where the foreign fighters have come from. And the numbers are a little bit squishy. It's hard to say, but on average, if you land around 30,000 or so foreign fighters who have traveled to Syria and Iraq over the past handful of years, that is more total than the foreign fighters over a more than 10-year period that traveled to Afghanistan. And if you look at the countries, those 80-plus countries where the foreign fighters have come from over these past few years, that at the top of the list is Tunisia. And then it's Saudis, and then it's Russia. Number 6 is France. This gentleman came from Tunisia. He had French citizenship. And the bottom part of this is, if you think about those 30,000 plus or so foreign fighters who have traveled to Syria and Iraq, general estimates are maybe 30 to 40% have returned home. So think about that. So part of this is just an operational statistical function of the fact that they've got more people now who return to France over the past few years, who are committed, who have been on the battlefield, and are very motivated to continue the fight now in the West.
Right, and we know that there are extremists in France, and there are areas that people do not even go because certain Muslim communities will not assimilate into the rest of the community. Isn't that right, Mike?
Yeah, that is, and part of it again is because for years now, for decades, the theory in France and Germany, the UK, and other parts has been this idea of celebrate your own culture.
Yeah.
You know, here in the U.S., we still tend to say you come to America, you're American first. You know, and we do a better job here over the years. It's not perfect, but we do a better job of trying to assimilate, trying to blend people into our own culture. Whereas over there, it was it was an active campaign to say no, you're from wherever. That's your identity.
Right.
And so in a part, they've done this to themselves. They realize the dangers that has created, but it's the horse has left the barn.
Right, which is one of the reasons that the British people said no more. We're getting out of the EU. Now, President Obama condemned the attack, issuing a statement last night. Mike, this is what he said, quote, "On behalf of the American people, I condemn in the strongest terms what appears to be a horrific terrorist attack in Nice, France, which killed and wounded dozens of innocent civilians. We stand in solidarity and partnership with France, our oldest ally, as they respond to and recover from this attack." Both presidential candidates also came out against it. Steve Rogers, weigh in here. What do you make of the way that this was done? Is this a new way that terrorists are trying, in other words, taking a truck and plowing it into people?
Well, they're changing the way of warfare. They're changing the weapons of war. Many places they know they can't get guns into, or the samurai swords, or the explosives, so they're going to use vehicles. And this was very, very effective. Let me add one thing, Maria. The president comes out with this statement, as he always does. He'll light up the White House in the French colors, and he'll do nothing. Hillary Clinton has echoed that. It seems to me that Donald Trump is the only leader right now in this world who's willing to take ISIS on. And that's what they understand. They understand might, and they fear the might of the United States. We just have to use it.
Yeah, and as soon as this the news came out, Mike, Donald Trump announced on Greta's show on Fox News last night that he would postpone his vice presidential announcement. And then Hillary Clinton also called into the show and talked about getting tough, but didn't really offer specifics, Mike Baker.
Yeah, look, the frustration, I think, on the part of the president is enormous. I mean, the last thing he wanted is for his time in office to be defined by the war on terror. We know that. I mean, his focus is completely elsewhere. He's never been fully engaged. And so this is an incredibly frustrating situation for him. But and to be fair, again, we have to look at everything in a very realistic point of view. Are we having some success in Syria and Iraq, as the White House says? Well, yes, we are. Are we doing that enough? Are we doing it enough? Are we aggressive enough? Well, no, we're not. Does it mean that the attacks that we're seeing, as John Kerry has pointed out, as the White House has said, when we see an attack like what's just happened in Nice or in Orlando, their tendency is to say, well, it's because we're winning on the ground in Syria and Iraq, and this is desperation on their part, and they're in the sort of the final death throes of their existence, which is complete nonsense. Look, we've seen this play out before. When we went into Afghanistan right after 9/11, we decimated a lot of the structure of al-Qaeda, and it was a terrific tactical mission. We saw what happened to al-Qaeda. They flattened out. We had more support cells around the world acting on their own. We had more aggressive attacks in the West, individually, these types of attacks. We know that this is going to happen. So whether we're talking about the enemy being ISIS in a caliphate situation, or whether we're talking about a different structure, again, you go back to the 30,000 feet level, it's all the same. It's jihadism, it's extremism. The enemy, maybe they call themselves something different, but it stays the same.
Mike, thank you very much for your insights this morning. We appreciate it. Mike Baker there. Donald Trump, of course, postponing that vice presidential announcement in the wake of this deadly terror attack in France. We've got more on that after this short break. Stay with us.